Have you ever met someone and misjudged them completely? This is a story that will change how you see the world. Welcome to Valor Stories. You don't belong here, sir. Please step away from the entrance now. The younger guard's voice was firm, final. The elderly man didn't flinch. He simply placed his briefcase down, adjusted his sleeve, revealing a faded patch with an insignia most people didn't recognize, then looked at the lobby behind them, calmly replied, "I've stood at entrances far more dangerous than this. I'm just keeping a promise." But then the head of security arrived. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask any questions. He looked at the patch on the old man's sleeve and immediately snapped to attention. The lobby fell silent. Phones dropped because someone they mocked had just been saluted. It was a Monday morning like any other in downtown Houston. The glass towers shimmered under the rising sun and the lobby of the United Federal Building bustled with the usual rhythm. Heels clicking on tile, voices echoing off the high ceilings, and phones glued to ears. People moved with purpose. Suits brushed past interns. Delivery men wheeled carts through side entrances. Security nodded at regulars, barely looking up from their monitors. But near the center of the lobby, by the revolving glass door, stood someone that didn't quite fit. He wasn't blocking traffic. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't muttering or acting erratic. He just stood there, still as stone, clutching a brown leather briefcase with both hands. His olive green jacket looked military in origin, though faded by time, and softened at the cuffs. On the upper sleeve was a round patch, dark, nearly invisible, except to the trained eye. A single star, worn and ghostly. People noticed. Some looked twice. Others slowed down just long enough to register his presence and then hurry past as if distance would remove their discomfort. A woman in a beige suit leaned to her coworker and whispered, "He's been standing there since I got my coffee." "He homeless?" the coworker asked without looking. "No, too clean, too still." "Maybe a vet." The man hadn't moved since 7:05 a.m. At 7:29, a young intern from the law firm on floor 16 passed by, earbuds in, and gave him a sideways glance. The old man didn't blink, didn't follow the movement. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the front desk, maybe toward the elevators, maybe towards something else entirely. At 7:31, two security guards, neither older than 30, watched him from behind the desk. They didn't say anything, but their body language shifted. Shoulders squared, eyes narrowing, one hand drifting toward the little button beneath the counter. At 7:33, a client from Homeland Procurement Services approached the desk and said with a chuckle, "You got a protester or something?" That's when the receptionist, Melinda, mid-40s, sharp blazer, never missed a day, finally pressed the button. A soft beep. A green light blinked on. "Security, this is front desk. We may have a situation." In the security room 2 floors above, a red light flickered on the panel. One of the younger guards, Jesse, looked up from his crossword. He leaned into the mic. "Copy that. What's the description?" "Older male, maybe late 70s, military coat, just standing. Not disruptive, but not moving either." Jesse raised an eyebrow. "Armed, no visible weapons, holding a briefcase." "Copy. Dispatching unit." Back in the lobby, the old man stood unchanged. His posture wasn't slouched. If anything, it had the uprightness of someone who had been trained to stand still for hours. His eyes weren't glazed over. They were focused, watchful, calm. A janitor passed him by and gave a polite nod. The old man nodded back just once. That was the only movement in 10 minutes. The elevator dinged behind the front desk. 2 security officers stepped out in matching black blazers marked Federal Protection. One carried a radio clip to his belt. The other had the stance of someone who used to play football and never let it go. They approached with firm steps. One tapped the old man's shoulder. He didn't flinch. "Sir, can we help you?" The old man didn't respond at first. Then quietly, as if remembering how to use his voice, he said, "I have an appointment of sorts." "With who, sir?" He looked at them. Then, really looked. There was no fear in his eyes, no confusion, just a kind of patient certainty that disarmed more than it challenged. "Not sure anymore," he said. "But I was told this is where I should come." The guards exchanged glances. One turned toward the desk and made a subtle hand gesture. The receptionist nodded. It was clear. This wasn't going to be a simple loitering call. Not today. Not with this man. Not with that patch. And somewhere, without anyone realizing it yet, something was about to shift. The click of leather shoes echoed across the polished lobby floor as two security officers made their way toward the elderly man. Their uniforms were sharp, badges polished, and eyes sharp with the kind of confidence that comes from being in control of a space until something disrupts the rhythm. And today, that disruption wore an old military jacket. "Sir," the taller of the two said, stepping into the man's line of sight. "This is a restricted area. Visitors must sign in and have pre-approved access." The old man didn't move, didn't even blink. His hands rested calmly on the handle of his briefcase, the same as they had for nearly half an hour. The second guard circled a little, glancing at the patch on the man's sleeve. It looked military, sure, but nothing official. Too old, too faded. Could be anything, he thought. Could be nothing. "Sir," the first guard repeated firmer now. "Do you have an appointment identification? If not, we'll need you to vacate the premises." "AAM." The old man's voice was quiet yet clear. "I'm waiting for someone," he said. "I was told to meet him here." "That was a long time ago." The first guard frowned. "What does that even mean?" "I had an agreement," the old man said again, eyes scanning the lobby as if searching for something only he could still see. "Long before you started working here." "Okay," the shorter guard huffed, arms crossed. "You don't have clearance. You don't have ID and you don't have an appointment. You can't just loiter because of some memory." The older man turned toward them. His gaze didn't sharpen. He wasn't angry, but something in his stillness made both guards feel like they were the ones being sized up. "I made a promise," he said simply. The taller guard scoffed. "Look, sir, I get it. You're someone's grandfather. Maybe a vet. Maybe just having a rough day. But we've got protocol. You're not on any list. No badge, no paperwork, nothing." Then came the line that made a few heads turn. "This isn't 1950. Nobody waits for a handshake anymore, especially not in a lobby like this." The second guard added with a laugh, louder than necessary. "Yeah, these days promises don't mean much unless they come with a barcode." People nearby chuckled. A few onlookers glanced up from their phones. Still, the old man didn't flinch. He took a slow breath and finally said, "You may not understand this, son, but there was a time when a man's word meant more than a signature, more than clearance. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just keeping my word." The taller guard softened for a second, then caught himself. He looked around, saw people watching. He didn't like the attention. Didn't like that this was getting complicated. He stepped closer. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to pick up your bag and we're going to escort you outside. You can wait out on the steps if you like, but you're not staying in here." Behind him, the front desk had gone quiet. Even the receptionist paused her typing. The old man nodded once, almost respectfully. Then he bent slowly to adjust his briefcase. That's when the shorter guard noticed it again. That patch closer now. He squinted. "Hey, what's that?" he asked. The taller one rolled his eyes. "Probably from a costume store. Or a surplus shop," someone from the back muttered. "It's nothing," the shorter guard said, almost trying to convince himself. But the old man, he heard that. He stood back up, brushed his sleeve slightly, and said quietly, "It's not for sale." The response wasn't combative. It was final, like someone closing a door softly but permanently. For a long second, no one moved. Then from the hallway behind the front desk came the sound of a door opening. Heavy boots on tile, a rhythm different from the rest of the building's flow. One of the receptionists lifted her head. Another guard, older, more seasoned, stepped into view. His pace wasn't rushed. His posture wasn't defensive, but as soon as he caught sight of the man in the jacket, his expression changed. He didn't bark orders. He didn't ask questions. He just kept walking straight toward the man everyone else had dismissed. And the air in the lobby shifted because something unspoken had just entered the room. Something these younger guards couldn't identify but suddenly felt, and what happened next would silence every voice in the building. Can you imagine the shock of realizing you've underestimated a hero? Stay with us on Valor Stories. The air in the lobby had changed subtly at first, like the way a thunderstorm announces itself long before a single drop of rain. The old man didn't speak again. He simply lowered his briefcase slowly, letting it rest on the edge of a nearby bench. It was worn smooth at the corners, the kind of leather that had crossed continents in decades. A brass buckle snapped loose with a soft click. The taller guard took a step forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop right there." But the old man didn't. With deliberate calm, he opened the flap and reached inside. For a split second, tension rippled through the room. Phones lifted into the air. Two civilians ducked behind a marble column. A man by the elevators cleared his throat as if preparing to bolt if necessary. From within the briefcase, the old man produced a letter. Its creases were deep and yellowed. The envelope was thin from years of folding and unfolding, with a faded red stamp that read "Classified 1974. Though the ink had bled slightly with time, he held it gently like something sacred. The shorter guard leaned in. "What's that supposed to be?" The old man didn't answer. He unfolded it slowly. Inside there was no weapon, no badge, no identification, just a single-page letter typed in bold black ink on yellowing paper. He began to read aloud, voice low but steady. "To whom it may concern, if I am ever unable to complete the mission as scheduled, I will entrust Major C. Halverson with full communication authority as agreed under the R4 protocol." The taller guard didn't let him finish. With a smirk, he stepped forward and snatched the paper from the man's hand. "Seriously," he laughed, holding it up like a napkin someone spilled coffee on. "You think this is real, sir? I've seen better fakes on Reddit." The old man didn't reach for it. He simply closed the briefcase with quiet finality, then looked away, not in defeat, but in something that felt like disappointment. The guard waved the letter toward the crowd, addressing no one in particular. "Look at this. Classified in courier font. What is this? Cold War cosplay?" A few chuckles rang out. Someone muttered, "Who brings Cold War fanfiction to a government building?" Another voice, younger, added, "I swear if he pulls out a medal next, I'm giving him 5 stars on Yelp." A woman in business casual leaned to her coworker. "Should we call someone?" Her coworker, a man in khakis holding a latte, said, "Yeah, maybe 911 before he pulls a grenade out of that thing." The whole scene was unraveling. Phones were now clearly recording. A man near the entrance panned his camera across the room like he was documenting a crime scene. A woman whispered into her phone, "Something's going on at the federal building. Some old vet or crazy guy. It's wild." But amid the growing chaos, the old man stood completely still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He didn't even ask for the letter back. Instead, he just looked forward toward the far side of the lobby, toward the hallway behind the front desk. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "It was never meant for you." The word stopped the shorter guard mid-laugh. "What was that?" he asked, letter still dangling from his fingers. But the old man didn't repeat himself. His gaze never shifted. And that's when the sound returned. Boots, heavier than dress shoes, measured, intentional. From the hallway beyond the main desk, a figure emerged. Broad shoulders, pressed collar, ID badge clipped to his lapel. A man in his 50s, maybe early 60s, hair silver at the temples, eyes scanning the lobby, not with confusion, but with purpose. He moved past the desk, past the civilians, straight toward the center of the room. The younger guard turned and whispered, "Who's that?" The receptionist, suddenly pale, answered softly, "That's Ree, head of security." And Ree wasn't smiling. He stopped a few feet from the old man who still hadn't moved. Then Ree looked down at the letter in his officer's hand. He didn't reach for it, didn't speak. His eyes drifted from the letter to the patch on the old man's sleeve. And when he saw it, he froze. No one else in the lobby knew what it meant, but Reese did. He had only seen that insignia once before, buried deep in a file that required 4 levels of clearance just to view the first paragraph. Reese looked up straight into the old man's eyes and stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask questions. Instead, with the sharpness of a man who still remembered what discipline looked like, he adjusted his posture and said, "Sir." And then he snapped to attention. The call had come through the radio just moments earlier. At first, Ree, head of security for the entire federal complex, had barely looked up from his desk. Possible loiterer, older male, briefcase, non-compliant. The voice crackled. Nothing unusual. But then came a second detail. He's carrying a document labeled Classified 1974. Claims he's here on unfinished business. That made Reese sit up. Then the final detail hit his ears like a punch. He's wearing a jacket with some kind of old unit patch on the sleeve. Not standard issue. Reese didn't speak. He just stood, reached for his coat, and left his office. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs. Old habit, muscle memory. Ree had served 22 years in the Marine Corps. He'd seen patches. He'd worn enough to know which ones meant real service and which ones meant something far rarer. As he descended, his boots struck the concrete stairs with deliberate force. Something about that call, it stirred an ache in the back of his neck. Not dread, not even curiosity. It was something deeper, a pull he hadn't felt in years. When he stepped into the lobby, the noise hit him immediately. Voices, cameras, nervous laughter. And at the center of it all stood the man, still silent, just as described. And then Reese saw it. The patch, worn, frayed, ghosted over from decades of sun and rain, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever had to sign a classified clearance form on a mission that didn't officially exist. It wasn't a regular unit insignia. It wasn't in any recruitment poster or training manual. It was the symbol of a clandestine recon unit used during the Cold War. Only ever activated when diplomacy had failed and no flag was safe to carry. Reese's breath hitched. He didn't blink. He just froze for half a second. It was as if time had buckled. The marble floors, the polished counters, the fluorescence overhead, all of it blurred behind the sudden gravity of that single insignia. Then Ree moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked slowly, intentionally, parting the small crowd without a word. People backed away instinctively, not because of rank, but because something in his presence now felt different, like something sacred had entered the room, and no one quite knew how to act. The guard stepped aside as Ree approached the elderly man. The old man didn't smile, didn't flinch. He simply met Reese's gaze. And Ree, former Marine, now head of a building built on structure and protocol, felt the weight of memory. He raised one hand, palm flat, fingers open, and gestured to the bystanders. "Foes down, please," he said calmly but firmly. A few phones dropped, others wavered. "Now," he added. That did it. The crowd obeyed. Silence stretched across the lobby like a drawn curtain. Ree took one more step forward. He came to a full stop. Then eyes on the patch once more. He stood tall, straight as a parade ground pole and saluted. It wasn't casual. It wasn't ceremonial. It was earned. And in a voice just loud enough to carry across the room, he said, "It's an honor, Colonel Halverson." The silence became something deeper, a kind of hush that presses against the chest, reverent, humbling. The young guards who had mocked him were now statues. The crowd, once amused, was speechless, and the old man. He didn't return the salute. He didn't need to. He simply gave a faint nod. A nod that said, "I remember." A nod that said, I accept. A nod that said, this was enough. Ree lowered his hands slowly, blinking as if waking from a moment that wasn't meant to last. Then quieter now, almost to himself, he added, they said you disappeared, that you were gone, but you came back. Colonel Halverson finally spoke, his voice smooth with gravel and time. No one disappears, son. Not completely. Some promises just take longer to keep. And with that, the moment was sealed. It would not be forgotten. Not by the crowd, not by the guards, and certainly not by the man who once wore the eagle, globe, and anchor, who now stood humbled before a legend he'd never expected to meet. The silence held, stretching across the lobby like a sacred pause. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The old man, Colonel Halverson, remained steady, hands at his sides, the faint outline of the insignia on his sleeve still catching the morning light through the glass. Ree slowly turned to face the others. He didn't have to say anything, but something in his posture, his eyes told the crowd that this moment was not over. A younger staffer near the elevators whispered, "Who is he?" Ree heard it. He looked at the cluster of guards, civilians, and building employees around him. And in that rare moment when rank, history, and reverence aligned, he began to speak. He's not supposed to exist, Ree said softly. At least not on paper. He paused, looking back at Halverson, then returned his gaze to the group. Colonel Charles Halverson was the commanding officer of a Cold War recon unit so classified even the Pentagon couldn't fully acknowledge its existence. They operated in East Berlin, Havana, Seoul, Tehran, places no flag could fly. A murmur moved through the crowd. They were the ones who went in before diplomacy and stayed long after the diplomats left. There were only 3 Americans ever known to have completed that many black missions under total silence. Of those 3, 2 were confirmed Kia. 1 simply vanished. He turned slowly. And that one is standing right here. No one dared to interrupt. Even the younger guards who'd laughed just minutes ago now stood with their arms at their sides, eyes lowered slightly, humbled. Ree continued, he's a decorated intelligence operative, though his medals, if they even exist, were never awarded in public. Not one ceremony, no press, not even a file number the government would admit to. The old man finally moved. He stepped forward, not with pride, but with quiet purpose, and placed his briefcase back on the bench. Without a word, he opened it once more and removed a small folded paper. Not the letter this time. This was older, thicker, almost fragile. He unfolded it carefully. Then, speaking just loud enough to be heard, he began to recite. Service number 015-4826. Unit code Theta Echo 6. Mission tag Sand Dagger. Status Xfil complete. Classified. Date of termination indefinite. Ree nodded slowly, recognizing each word. No one else in the room understood what it meant, but they felt it. The old man folded the paper again, gently, almost ceremonially. Then he returned it to the briefcase, closed it, and clicked the latches shut. And then he sat. He didn't demand attention. He didn't look up. He simply sat on the bench as if the weight of memory had returned to his shoulders and asked him to rest for just a moment. Ree looked around at the crowd, his voice lower now. Reverend, you all saw a man standing here, alone, forgotten, maybe strange, maybe suspicious. He motioned toward the briefcase. But what stood here was a ghost of history. A man who gave up recognition, reward, and retirement to finish something none of us even knew had started. Someone in the back, a woman in a gray blazer, asked, "Why come back now after all this time?" The old man opened his eyes slowly because he said, "I made a promise and it was supposed to be fulfilled here today." A pause to someone who isn't coming. No one dared ask more. He didn't need to explain the rest. A fallen comrade, a final rendezvous, a code among shadows honored decades later. Not with ceremony, but with presence. And presence in this case was everything. The lobby had never been so still. No calls rang, no meetings rushed. For once, the building paused with him because now they knew the story and they would never look at that bench or that man the same way again. He didn't seem bitter, not angry, not even surprised. Colonel Halverson sat quietly on the bench, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase. The same stoic calm he held when security had confronted him never left his face. If anything, it had softened. Someone approached, tentative, unsure. A young woman from one of the upstairs offices. She crouched slightly and asked, "Sir, if you don't mind, why today? Why now?" The old man looked at her kindly, not annoyed, not guarded. Then in a voice that sounded like weathered oak, strong, low, textured with years, he replied, "Because I made a promise." He paused a moment as if choosing the fewest words with the most weight. "We had a rule. My team and I, if anything went wrong, if any of us disappeared, this lobby, this building would be the place, the one we'd come back to. No phones, no letters, no radio, just presence." He glanced up toward the high windows where the sunlight poured in like a gentle flood. "We trained ourselves to go silent, to vanish, but we never wanted each other to disappear completely." The woman nodded softly, rising to her feet again, but the old man wasn't done. "I lost contact with him in 1974. The mission split us apart. We were never meant to speak again, but we made one last deal. If you ever make it out and I don't, wait for me on the anniversary." Ree, still standing a few steps away, asked quietly, "Today's the date?" Halverson looked at him and nodded. 48 years ago to the hour. His last transmission was at 9:14 a.m. He didn't make it. I did. So I waited. No one spoke for a long while. It wasn't grief on his face. He'd processed that years ago. It was devotion. Not the kind you find in ceremonies or medals, but the kind only known to those who've been through something unspeakable with another soul. The kind of loyalty forged when lives were shared. Silence was weaponized and promises weren't backed by paper, but by blood. A soft chime rang through the lobby, the sound of an arriving elevator. People turned, but Halverson didn't. He just sat there, eyes misted now, but unwavering. Ree, moved by something deeper than duty, stepped closer. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Halverson gave a faint smile. Didn't think it mattered anymore. Besides, he glanced around at the lobby, at the people, the building, the modern world around him. Some promises are meant to be kept quietly. He leaned back slightly, resting into the bench, the briefcase still by his side, unopened again. The letter returned to silence, the patch covered once more, but the weight of the moment of what had been said and what hadn't lingered in the room, and no one dared disturb it. The rest of the morning passed differently. People who had once laughed, once stared, once dismissed him, now approached him with quiet steps and lowered eyes. One by one they came. An intern placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "I'm sorry, sir." A man from Homeland Security removed his cap and nodded deeply, "Thank you for everything, I'll never know." Even the two young guards, those who had mocked the patch, doubted the paper, doubted him, stood silently before him. One managed to speak. "We were wrong, sir." The old man didn't gloat. He didn't correct them. He just nodded. Forgiveness was never asked for, but somehow it was given. Later, as the morning sun climbed higher and the crowd thinned, Colonel Halverson stepped outside. No ceremony followed, no motorcade, no formal send-off, just him and a bench beneath the building's flagpole. He sat down with the same slow, steady grace that had defined his every move. From his wallet, he pulled out a worn photograph. Creased at the corners, the edges curled. In the picture, 4 young men sat side by side, grinning despite soot and mud on their faces. Fire flickered in the background, either from a mission or a makeshift camp, but their eyes burned brighter. The one on the far right had his arm slung across Halverson's shoulder. It was him, the man he'd waited for. He stared at the photo for a long time, then slipped it gently back into his wallet. Not all heroes fade. Some return quietly. Not for glory, not for recognition, just to remember. Sometimes the loudest acts of honor make no sound at all. In an age of noise, quick judgments, and headlines that vanish within hours, stories like Colonel Halverson's remind us of something many have forgotten. Dignity doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives and waits. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand recognition. He waited quietly, faithfully to honor a promise made decades earlier. Not for himself, but for a brother in arms who never came home. And in doing so, he reminded an entire building and now perhaps thousands of viewers that real honor doesn't need applause. It just needs to be kept. In today's world, where commitment is often seen as optional, or even friendships fade with convenience, Halverson's story asks us, what promises have we forgotten? And which ones are still worth keeping no matter how long it takes? There's another lesson here too about perception. How many people passed him that morning and thought he was just a confused old man? How many of us have done the same? Judge someone by their clothes, their age, their silence. Yet behind that quiet figure was a life of service, sacrifice, and secrets no one could have guessed. Now we turn to you, our viewers on Valor Stories. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you misjudged someone? Someone who turned out to be much more than what they seemed? Or maybe you've kept a promise for years, even when no one else remembered it. Share your story in the comments. Let others see how kindness, loyalty, and humility still matter. Thank you for spending your time with us on Valor Stories. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and help us continue sharing moments that remind us all of what truly matters. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.